Okay, so self-talk is our discussion today, or consideration today. We've been thinking about this issue of intrapersonal communication, not interpersonal communication, but intra. And that means that's a communication that goes on within you. And last day we looked at the self, the whole dynamics of the self, because each one of us is a self. We're a person, we're an individual. We have value. We're significant. And as I've shared before, I believe God created us in his own image, which gives us inherent value. And how we treat ourselves is a very important issue there. Uh, we in fact do talk to ourselves in our mind. It's that voice that goes on in our mind, and how we choose to talk to ourselves and things that we do impact on our sense of well-being. I'm not saying we should be walking around saying things like, I'm the most wonderful person the world has ever known. That's egotistical and that's arrogant. But we should walk around saying to ourselves, I have high value. I am worth something. I've been given life for a reason, and I should use it well. And so this is an important field of communication. It goes on all the time with all of us. And really, people who are going to be high achievers often say stuff to themselves that make that difference. If you're constantly saying to yourself, I can't do it, you're probably not going to be able to do whatever it is you say you can't do. I say to my students in my public speaking courses, I have 4 sections of them. In fact, I have one right after this class. And I have to end the course a little bit earlier only because I have to get recording going. Excuse me. I have to take this recording that we're doing and have it downloaded before I go into my next class. Anyways, I say to my students in public speaking, watch yourself talk, because you can talk yourself into doing poorly. It is better to talk to yourself and build yourself up. I'm going to be able to do this. I will do just fine. And then go and do the best you can. Self-talk traps are those moments when we say negative things to ourselves. And it really impacts our sense of well-being. We actually abuse ourselves with our talk. That happens quite often. I've done it. And there have been times when I've really been upset with myself. Let me just share one moment where my self-talk, I hurt myself by my self-talk. Oh, the faculty, or many of the faculty of the religious department and the at the undergrad level, and then the seminary at the graduate level, and I taught at the seminary level, we were meeting, and it was for gaining accreditation at a particular a particular organization that would be valuable. It makes the degree stronger. And so this person, a couple of people had flown up from Chicago to meet with us and to work through some of the stuff related to accreditation. And the man asked a question. We were all sitting there together, and he said, hey, I've got a question just to get ourselves started. And he asked this question. And I said to myself, I think I know what the answer should be. And I thought about it and said, oh, but I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, then I'm going to look silly. I probably shouldn't say anything. I wish I would say, I know I'm too nervous about saying something. And I didn't say anything. And then the man said, well, let me give you the answer to my question. And he said almost word for word what was in my mind. And the other professors went, whoa, well, that's a good thought. And I'm sitting there saying, but I had that thought in my head the whole time. I could have looked really good to everybody. If I had just spoken up, I knew the answer. but I used self-talk in a negative way, and it prevented me from being able to say something that would have been a good contribution. Now, I've also used self-talk, and probably you have too, in a positive way. Now, here's one that I used. When I was working on my Doctor of Education degree at Oregon State University, I taught communication courses. And often after the students left, I'd have a few moments. And I would go up to the blackboard or the whiteboard, and I'd print my name, Curtis Congo, and then I'd put a comma behind that, and then I'd put these initials, capital E, small d, period, capital D, period. And then I would go to the front of my name and I'd write these two letters, DR, period, capital D, small r, period. What I was doing was saying to myself, that is why you are at Oregon State University, to become a doctor of education. So Dr. Curtis Congo, and then comma, and behind my name, EDD, ED stands for education, and the second D, doctor, so EDD. Like when you go see a medical doctor, you go see an MD. Well, I'm an EDD. And I would tell myself, this is why you're here. Never forget that. You are here to achieve that. And getting a doctorate degree is not like getting a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. It's much more challenging. Only about 7 to 8% of people who enter a doctoral program in the United States, probably true in Canada, complete it. And therefore, you better have something that helps you want to achieve it. And so you have to think about, what do you do to get there? And I decided one of the things I would do periodically is that I would look at the fact that I needed to give myself a word of encouragement to be able to stay the ground, to be able to make it. And so that's exactly what I did as I was working through my my degree program. I'm just noticing that some other people are here, and I'm just getting their okay, got that and got that person. Good. And I talked to myself positively. Did it help? Yes, it did help. It helped in the sense that I had a positive attitude. Now, just having a positive attitude doesn't guarantee anything, but having a negative attitude is almost a guarantee of problems. And so self-talk, talking to yourself, has a valuable place, and we all do it in some way, but we need to be careful because we can self-talk ourselves into trouble. So basically what I wanted to do today is to simply take time to go through 10 cognitive self-talk traps that are very, very easy for us to fall into. And it impacts us in all aspects of life. So we need to be very cognizant of what we say to ourselves. If you say to yourself, you're stupid, you're stupid, you're stupid, you're stupid, in your mind, you're going to begin to believe you are stupid. It's like abusing yourself. And it's just not wise. It does not help. So let's consider these 10 self-talk traps. Now you have this PowerPoint, so you'll be able to go back and read it and go over it. You certainly should take notes. It can be very helpful for you just to have that. So I'm just trying to get the first one up here. There we are. Here's the first of the 10 self-talk traps. One is the issue of all or nothing thinking. You see things in black or white categories. If a situation is anything less than perfect, you say it is a total failure. All or nothing. If you made 75% right and 25% you didn't make it, you kind of just say it doesn't count. Well, that's not wise. Because the reality is that the greatest achievements, the greatest inventions in life did not happen when somebody said, I'm going to invent whatever, and they put it together and there it is, and it works. It doesn't work that way. It's experiment. That's what experiments are about. You experiment to keep trying to understand something and to learn something and to grow from something. You don't get 100% right all the time. It's unwise to think that way. Yet there are people who, if they don't get 100% right, throw it all away saying it didn't count. It wasn't worth anything. And that's just not fair to yourself at all. All or nothing thinking is very, very dangerous. So please be aware that if you get a significant right, then you've grown from that. If you read a book, you're not going to remember everything in the book, but let's say you remembered 50%, that would be phenomenal. That's big growth. Let's put it in the sports world. If you were playing baseball, professional baseball, and you went to bat and you got 40% right. In other words, 40% of the time you hit the ball safe and got to first base at least. If you did that 40% of the time, you'd be making multi-millions of dollars a year because you'd be considered a success because you got 40% right. In other words, you batted what they call 400. It's not all or nothing. If every batter who played baseball said, if I don't get on base every time by hitting the ball, then I'm a failure, we would have nothing but failures in baseball. The fact is that we're not going to hit 100%. We're not going to do an experiment and have it all work out exactly right the first time. We're not going to just jump into a car and have somebody give us one lesson and then be able to go out and drive the car successfully. It takes practice, it takes learning, and mistakes happen, and they're actually necessary because in mistakes we learn. A child doesn't stand up one day and start walking without having probably fallen down a few times. They're not always successful until they find that balance, and then all of a sudden, then they start to walk. It's not an all or nothing sort of thinking world that we live in. You're not always going to be successful. You're not always going to get 100% in all your exams. You're not always going to have everything perfect. It's just not going to happen at all. And so we have to be careful of that trap because knowing that we can't always be perfect, sometimes people don't care. The fact is that they're not perfect bothers them. And they almost quit on stuff. Do you know, when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, it took me 3 months to write one sentence, which was the problem statement for my research. And it became the title of my dissertation. And once I had that one sentence, it took me 3 months to get this. Listen, this is what took me 3 months. A study of job factors as satisfiers and dissatisfiers of members of the National Association of Directors of Christian Education. 3 months of my life. I kept coming into my professor and he kept challenging it and I backed away and I'd go try to work on it. I would go to see him a few times every week with what I thought was a possibility of my focus of my research. And each time he kind of took me on and I backed away. And then one day, what I just said to you, my dissertation title, a study of job factors as satisfiers and dissatisfiers of members of the National Association of Directors of Christian Education. Once I had that, I walked in to see him and he started attacking it, as was his job, to see how I'd handle it. And I pushed back and I told him the rationale and that this made sense and that this was right and that this was worthy of the research that I believed I was supposed to go in and do. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, now you're ready to go pursue your dissertation research project. 3 months of my life just on one little sentence. What would have happened if the first time he said, no, that doesn't work? And I said, well, I guess I can't do a doctoral degree. Goodbye. That's silly. So we need to be careful on our self-talk that we don't always think that everything that we do has to always work out everything is not black and white. Not everything works out exactly the way we want. Sometimes there is partial failure, but there's often success even in partial failure, if we could just see it that way. Or nothing is a trap. And we need to be very careful that we don't enter into that trap, because it's a serious one. A second trap is overgeneralization. It's overgeneralizing. You see, a person sees a single event as a never-ending pattern of defeat by using the words always or never when you think about it. I always do this the wrong way. I never get this right. That's overgeneralization. When I drive a car, if I were to make a mistake and say, you know what, I always make mistakes driving the car, I never will be able to be a good driver. I should not drive, because I'm going to be dangerous, because I'm talking myself into actually being the very thing I say I am. Do we make mistakes? Yes, we make mistakes. But we can overgeneralize and use the words always. I always do this wrong. I never can figure this out. And we got to be careful about that usage of that word, those two words, because they're not always the case at all. There are times probably you've actually been successful in something that you perhaps don't really do as well as other people. It's not 100% wrong, 100% right. And so we need to be careful about overgeneralizing, because when we do that, what we basically do is create a never-ending pattern of defeat, because we've put ourselves into that position. We're never going to be able to do it then if we always overgeneralize. And overgeneralization is very dangerous. We've had that happen with our daughters when they've come home and said, I never have, I always, and we've always challenged them. Really? Is that the case? It's not the case at all. It's not always a bad situation. It's not a never situation. Sometimes it is. To say, you know what, there are times when I do this, I make mistakes. That's fair. But to say, whenever I try to do this, I always make mistakes, probably that's overgeneralization to the extreme, very dangerous for yourself. Because if you do that enough, you know what you do? You lie yourself into a position of not attempting something, not taking chances. There's a time in our lives that we have to be willing to risk, and we have to be willing to take a chance. Not always. We should be thoughtful when we do it. Can you imagine if you had decided, if you come from a foreign country, I don't think I can go to Canada because I never have been able to handle the pressure of being on my own. I don't know if I can go to Trinity Western University because I really struggle all the time with all forms of language. Does it mean you don't at times? Of course you do. I mean, I know that many of you come from foreign countries. I admire you coming and learning a new language or improving on a language and learning to operate on a daily basis on a language that's not your mother tongue is a very significant thing to have happen. And for you to be able to say, you know what? I went, I studied there, I learned the language. I made mistakes when I used the language. I had to learn the significance of words in that language. And so I need to realize that because you're here, it doesn't mean you haven't ever made a mistake in our language or our culture. I'm sure you have. I would probably in your culture. I probably would struggle, just like you probably had to work through issues in this particular culture. So we have to be careful not to overgeneralize. Man, when you do that, you throw away creativity. You throw away taking chances. You people, many of you have come from foreign countries. That very act of doing that is astonishing. I just was watching a speech of a student of mine in my public speaking course this morning who said his parents said he could come to Canada to study, and he was 15 years old. 15. And I went, wow, I would not have wanted to do it at 15. That's too young for me, or would have been. So be careful of all or nothing thinking, and certainly of overgeneralization statements that we make. And we do make them quite often. And it can be very, very, very difficult. So be careful on that self-talk of overgeneralization. A third cognitive trap, self-talk trap, that impacts us in our self-talk is the mental filter. The mental filter is something like when a person picks out a single negative detail and dwells on it exclusively. One word of criticism erases all the praise you've received. And so what we do is somebody says something to us that's negative, and all we can think about is what they said, which was so negative. Or maybe we did a spelling test when we were a kid and we got 9 out of 10 correct, but we got 1 wrong. And so we filter out the positive and we just look at with the filter, the negative detail. The reality is that we're going to make mistakes in life, and that the reality is we're going to have people say something negative to us. We're going to experience criticism. I've had to deal with criticism too, like you have, without doubt, and you will a lot more. It happens. And the trouble is that we make that one statement what we focus on, the mental filter. I filter out the 9 things I did right, and I focus on the one thing I did wrong because this person said it. So therefore I focus on it. It's a mental filter, and it is very, very harmful to us. We got to be careful. And if you become a parent, you have to think about this. No, there are times we have to discipline our children. But if we come down on them really hard and hit that mental filter, then they become very, very nervous about attempting things. So when your child comes home with 9 out of 10 right, don't set up that mental filter so that they think I'm a failure because I got 1 out of 10 wrong. So be very careful. We all have to think about that. In work situations I've been in, there have been times where we've had staff evaluations. And I have generally gotten pretty good scores, but never perfect scores. And sometimes I'll sit there and say, I got 3.7 out of 4. What did I do wrong? Why did I not get that other part 3.3? And we begin to forget. I forgot about the 3.7, and I started thinking about just the 0.3. Or don't do that. That does nothing but harm your situation. Now, does that mean you shouldn't be improving? Maybe on a test you got 70% or 75%. Does that mean you should sit back and say, that's good enough, I'm happy with that? No. What you should be happy with is doing the best you can and accepting the score. Do the best you can and learn to accept that score that comes with it. The mental filter can be very, very devastating. All or nothing thinking, overgeneralization, and mental filter all can be very, very harmful in your self-talk. Here's another self-talk: discounting the positive. You reject positive experiences by insisting they really don't count. If you do a good job, you tell yourself that anybody could have done that job as well, if not better. You discount what you do well. Don't do that. Every person listening to me right now has things that they do well that others don't do as well. That's why we need each other, because we all do certain things well, and we all need to be encouraged to be doing things well. But we're going to have to realize that when somebody says something positive to us about what we did well, we shouldn't discard that. Just a moment, I'm going to open the window here for myself. And so we need to be very careful about not discounting the positive, because uh, it can be nothing but painful when we do that by saying, oh, I got these right. That doesn't mean anything. I got several wrong. And so that's too bad. It doesn't count. Don't do that to yourself. It's very, very hard on you in the long run. Jumping to conclusions is another self-talk trap. Jumping to conclusions. Okay? Jumping to conclusions. You interpret things negatively when there are no facts to support your conclusion. Two common variations are mind reading. You arbitrarily conclude that someone is reacting negatively to you. And fortune telling, you assume and predict that things will turn out badly. You jump to conclusions. That's one that I struggle with. I jump to conclusions, and they're not always positive conclusions. My wife just the other day said, why do you so often jump to a negative conclusion? And I've done that. I remember once I was teaching a class, and there was a student sitting there, and the nonverbal language that he was giving me was so negative. It was like I was reading his body language, and I was reading it as he was almost, I could read him thinking, what a waste of my time sitting in this classroom. He was sitting almost in a defensive position with his hands kind of folded like this, watching me as I was talking the whole time. And I thought, man, I'm not getting through to him at all. And I jumped to conclusions that things were terrible, and that in regard to his way he viewed me. And he didn't say anything to me after class or anything like that, so I had no idea. So as the semester went on, and then we were talking. He and I were talking after class one day, and he says, "Do you remember that day when you were talking about blah blah blah, whatever it was?" And I said, "Yeah, okay, yeah." He said, "I was sitting there trying to think through what you were saying, and I suddenly realized everything you were saying made so much sense. And I was so focused. I wasn't even writing notes. I was just listening to you. I was just drinking in what you were saying." And I thought, well, no, I remember that day. You looked like you couldn't care less. You had your hands folded. Yet he was so involved listening to what I had to say. I had a class once that it had about 38 students, I think it was, in the class. It was a course on adult education. And I had 3 gals in the class that, well, they did give me a hard time. They almost felt that was their job. And they gave me a hard time by the way they asked questions. They weren't said graciously, sometimes sitting in a way that wasn't appropriate, as far as almost looking like they were uninterested, asking questions and sometimes almost sarcastically. And I allowed them to get into my head. And I jumped to a conclusion. I started thinking, I really am not a good teacher. I really should not be teaching. I'm not a good teacher. And those 3 gals gave me a rough time. And I thought, at the end of the semester, I had to look at my student evaluation of the course. And I was thinking, oh, this is going to be really painful. This is going to be painful. Because all the students probably were just like them. And then I looked at the student evaluations, the overall scores, and they were not just high, they were really high. And I looked at them and I was shocked. And then I began to realize those 3 gals had so thrown me for a loop that I began to self-talk myself into thinking, I can't teach. I shouldn't be doing this. When those very scores from those students were telling me quite the opposite. They were saying to me, you know what? You do this very, very well. So don't ever stop doing it. Keep doing it. So jumping to conclusions can be a problem. See, those 5 are pretty significant self-talk traps. And we all of us at some place, at some time, least do one of them, if not probably all of them at some point. Probably there's one or two of the 10 we do more than the others. The sixth one is magnification. You exaggerate the importance of your problems and shortcomings, or you minimize your desirable qualities. So to exaggerate the importance of your problems, or you minimize um, the your desirable qualities. And what we need to do is take a healthy look at ourselves and say, you know what? First of all, I'm a human being. Secondly, I will make mistakes. I'm not perfect. But thirdly, I'm also got abilities and gifts that are good for my family, good for my friends, good for my church, good for my school that I can do. There are things that I do well. And I'm not to brag about them. I don't mean that. And not to let my problems become bigger than they are, and not let my shortcomings become bigger than they are, and not to minimize my good qualities that I have. I bring something to the table. Every person in this room here brings something to the table. Everybody has abilities, significance, value. No, you can't do everything. I can't do everything. I can do certain things well. I've gotten used to teaching this way. I prefer in the classroom, because this is actually more tiring to me than teaching in the classroom. And but I love the teaching side of life. What I'm not good at is the technical side of life. I get challenged when it comes to not just using the computer, but if we get a new computer, I get challenged, or new programs or new approaches that I have to take in light of COVID-19. And it becomes overwhelming for me. So this is being recorded right now, and my wife will be the one that will, after it's been recorded, will put it on to YouTube for its availability. And there's a whole process doing that. It drives me up a wall. I'm not good with that sort of stuff, the details of that at all. She does quite well with that, actually. And so it's important for us to realize that there's a great danger when we exaggerate our problems and our shortcomings and minimize our desirable qualities that we have. We need to have a healthy look at who we are and acknowledge I do things well, and there are things I will never do well. It's not in my nature to do those things well. There are things that I don't even want to learn to do well, because it's the learning side of it's so significant. I have so much else to do. I don't want to do that. So we need to be aware that we can magnify our shortcomings, and we can minimize our qualities at our own expense. I mean, you become very miserable when you keep saying to yourself, you can't do that, when in fact you can do it. I won't be able to do it as well as others. Well, that's, who cares? Just do it and learn from it. Magnification. It's a self-talk tool we use that hurts us. A seventh one is emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning. We assume that our negative emotions reflect the way things really are. I feel guilty. I must be a rotten person. Because how I feel, that means I must be that. That's not true. I mean, there are times when I realize that I have negative emotions about something. That goes with life. But to make the conclusion I'm a loser is dangerous and wrong. It's emotional abuse that we give to ourselves when we do that sort of stuff. Emotional reasoning, assuming that negative emotions reflect what we really are. Now, that's not true. The reality is that emotional feelings can also come and go. Every time you feel bad, does that mean what you were doing at the time you're feeling bad means you're not good at it? Not really. You ever sat back and thought, what is it I do well? Seriously, have you ever sat back and said, well, here's the 4 or 5 things I do well? Good exercise. You should take out a piece of paper and just say that. What do I do well? I'm going to tell you something I do well, and you're going to say, ooh, I wouldn't want that. And I mean this seriously. I have professionally learned to suffer, and I do that very well. I have been abused. I have been had things done to me in the workplace that were totally wrong, totally unfair. And I remember a supervisor who allowed something to happen, and I lost my position. And there were about 500 stakeholders in this organization. And when they heard how I was let go without a reason, the people rose up. And the boss, the man who'd been there 23 years and almost called that place his own, within a year had to leave. And he moved from Vancouver, Washington to Minneapolis in Minnesota and the more eastern part of the United States. And so it's really important for us to think carefully about what we say to ourselves, and be careful about not letting negative emotions reflect a conclusion we make about ourselves. And it happens very, very easily. Another self-talk trap are the should statements. You tell yourself that things should be the way you hoped or expected them to be. Many people try to motivate themselves with should and should nots, as if they had to be punished before they could be expected to do anything. And those should not statements or should statements can be very harsh and very mean spirited on our own being. Again, I come back to this point I made earlier. You and I are human beings. We make mistakes. We will make mistakes. You will make mistakes. I will make mistakes. It's a reality that we experience. And we got to be careful that we don't sit there and punish ourselves unnecessarily. And it can impact us. A ninth self-talk trap that we need to be careful about is the issue of labeling. Labeling. This is an extreme form of all or nothing thinking. Instead of saying, I made a mistake, you attach a negative label to yourself. I'm a loser. I label myself as a loser because of this. Labeling, by the way, in my opinion, is the number one tool people use to bully somebody, to push them around emotionally. They label them. They tell them they're ugly, that they're stupid, that they're useless, that there's no value in them. They label them with a term. And the other person, if they listen to it well long enough and allows that person to keep doing it, begins to believe the label that has been given. The fact is that labels really are extreme. Are you a loser? If you be by are you a loser, did you ever make a mistake? And you say yes, well then you'd be a loser. But I don't buy that, because we all make mistakes. It's all part of life. It takes time to learn how to ride a bicycle. We'll make mistakes. Just because you didn't get it right away, does that mean you're a loser for bicycle riding? No. You got to be careful. But bullies do use labels to try to make another person feel terrible. In British Columbia a few years ago, you probably can Google this, by the way, by the descriptive. There was a young gal, I think she was a very young teenager, I think. And she was being labeled by her friends or people that she went to school with, and they were bullying her. And she came to a position where she couldn't take it anymore. It was overwhelming. And so she set up her video or iPad, and she had it recording her. And she'd made these signs, and she held up one sign that said stuff. Then she put it down, picked up another sign. And she kept doing it. And these signs were, signs related to really having been bullied. And after she'd gone through all those signs, and finished. She reached over, she stopped her camera. She set it up so other people could see it. She put it on YouTube. And then she ended her life. She committed suicide. It can happen. It's terrible. Just hard to comprehend. She was being labeled. And we can do it to ourselves. We can label ourselves as a loser. Do you know what? You need to take some time, not be arrogant. Don't say things not true, but say things that are positive about yourself to yourself, not out loud. Or if you're saying it out loud in a room where nobody else is. Listen, there's things that everybody in this class right here have that are of value and are significant. And I've learned to realize ever so often I need to label myself for what my wife said I was. She said, if there's one word that describes you, it's enthusiasm. Enthusiasm. And I've hung on to that word, enthusiasm. I am passionate. I enjoy being that. It's a positive label. And so what is that positive thing about you? In fact, is I have a book, I don't know where it is now, entitled Your One Word. And the author, who's a Canadian, wrote it, not, I don't think well written, but I think he makes a great point that every organization and every person actually, when you boil down who they are, you can come down to the key word. And I actually sat with Joanne and said, okay, let's talk about this. And so she said, well, what do you think my key word is? That one word. And I said, oh, that's simple. I said, you are steady. In our home here, she's the steady one. My daughters will call. One lives in Abbotsford here, not very far away, is a teacher, and her husband's a teacher, and they have 3 children. And they will call, she will call, and they will talk. And Joanne's the one that steadies everybody. And then my younger daughter, a little more like me, but a little bit different at the same time, steadies her in a different way. And then with me, the same thing. Overall, her presence steadies me. And that's the word, the label that's positive. So I said to her, well, okay, what's my label? She's very simple, enthusiastic, enthusiasm. And I am. And I like that label. But when we start taking on negative labels like pathetic, useless, those sort of negative things, we begin to pound ourselves into the ground and we make it very difficult to achieve. Now, we're not going to be everything, but we can be, and we are something. And that's what we ought to jump on and focus on. The last one is personalization and blame. Personalization and blame. You hold yourself personally responsible for events that aren't entirely under your control. Something goes wrong and you own it as if it's your fault, when in fact it wasn't. It was a set of circumstances beyond your control, or it was because another person failed to do something that they should have done, or because of any number of factors. We got to be careful we don't blame ourselves for everything. The reality is, this world existed before you, it will exist after you. So everything you say bad about, or what's bad about humanity, and in some way you almost take it on as if it's your fault, you are really hindering your cause. You're hurting yourself to over-personalize and to blame yourself for everything. Now, all 10 of these self-traps, there's a thin line. They're very connected together, okay? We need to realize that. But there's also a distinct difference between all 10 of them. And it's probably important for you to kind of sit down and say, hey, what really is my area that I need to be aware of, that I'm susceptible to? I'm sure there's more than one, like there is for most of us. Now, we need to respond to negative self-talk. And I think here's a kind of a practical thing that you could do. I'm going to got some notes here that won't take long, but before I get there, you really need to stop and capture your self-talk. Pay attention to yourself. I would suggest randomly you stop and listen to yourself and say, what am I saying to myself right now? Have a piece of paper and pencil and write it down. Go ahead and do that ever so often. Because what that does is it sensitizes you to the fact that you self-talk. It's very important to use uncomfortable emotions or moods, such as stress or depression or anxiety, as cues for listening to your self-talk. So when you're feeling down, you find yourself saying something negative to yourself, stop and identify the feeling you're experiencing right now, the emotion. Identify, what was I saying to myself right before I started feeling this way? Or what have I been saying to myself since I've been feeling this way? Stop and think about that. What am I saying? What am I saying? Often it's negative self-talk that brings you down more than anything else. When you're aware of going through a difficult time, you need to ask, what are you saying to yourself and to those issues that you're dealing with? So don't just let this be oh yeah, sure, so who cares? Fact is, it can be life itself. So we need to respond to negative self-talk for sure. Here's some things we need to do. Identify the negative self-talk. Well, you got those 10 traps as you're sitting there, and you study them long enough. After all, you say, wait a minute. I recognize that. Immediately, I recognize what I'm saying to myself, and I'm hurting myself as I'm saying this. That's jumping to a conclusion. I'm jumping to a conclusion. How do I know that? So first of all, identify the self-talk that you're having. Which of the 10 of them are there? Then argue with yourself. Argue with yourself. So you think that the argument is that you've jumped to a conclusion about something, and you think that that's the reality, that's the way it is. Am I really that difficult a person? You need to talk to yourself. Argue with yourself. If I'm such an unlikable person, why do my old friends still come around to see me, want to go out with me? Argue with yourself. Because often when we're negative self-talk, we're being quite not only negative, but we're being very harmful to ourselves. And we're allowing ourselves to hurt ourselves, and we have to stop that. How do you stop it? Arguing with yourself. Wait a minute. Am I like that all the time? Really? I don't think so. That changes the whole mindset. The chemical reactions in your brain change with just those various statements made. So argue with yourself. Do it often. And what you also do is you improve your capacity to begin to realize, you know what? What I'm saying to myself isn't always true, or even near always true. So identify the negative self-talk. Identify how wrong what it is, and which of those 10 self-talk traps it is. Argue with yourself. Do self-talk. Talk to yourself. Hey, wait a minute. If that's true, why is this? Number 3. Change your inner dialogue that is flawed. State things accurately and rationally. So change your dialogue. State things accurately and rationally. Not self-hype or excessive positive ideas. This is also distorted. You're not looking to distort yourself on the other side. Self-talk distorts you to being a loser. Arrogance and talking too positively about yourself is the opposite of arrogant. I mean, it is arrogance of a different type. Don't do that to yourself. It's not helpful at all. So realize that you can be over harsh on yourself or too easy on yourself. Neither is good. So change your inner dialogue that you recognize that is flawed. Fourth, ask for help from a friend. Ask for help from a friend. I've done that. I've had moments when I started sharing something and struggling with something, and I talked to another person about it, and they said, "Man, thanks for talking to me. I don't see that in you at all. I'm sure you have moments, but I always have found you to be such and such." And then they'll give an example of that. I go like, "Oh, okay, wait a minute. My friend or friends help me in regard to the moments when I get myself involved in a situation of self-talk. Not healthy." Write down your thoughts. Get them down. Sit down and write down your thoughts. Here's an idea of how to do it. You need a piece of paper and a pen with you all the time. But once you hear a negative self-thought coming in your mind, first write it down. What is the specific negative self-talk? Let's say you say this: "I always do lousy in job interviews." Let's just say that's the thought comes in your mind. Write it down. Okay, that's the automatic thought that came to your mind. Now on a second column, write down, what's that categorization? You go through those 10 things, you'll find, oh, that's probably overgeneralization. Am I always having terrible job interviews? No, not necessarily at all. And then have a rebuttal. So you have here's your thought, here's the category, now rebuttal it within your mind. Write down something like, "I did answer all the questions asked of me, but I left out something important. Next time, I'll include that." Well, that's fair. That's evaluation. There are things I could do and I could do better. And so I need to work on those. And so we need to write down our thoughts so that we have what our automatic thought is, what that category is, and what our personal rebuttal to that. And that trains the mind. See, when we just allow those thoughts to roam in our mind and we don't challenge ourselves, they begin to control our thinking. But when we stop and say, just a moment, is that always true? That thought, that's one of those 10 traps. That trap is this one. Now, is that really true? No, it's not always true. And you talk to yourself, you argue with yourself. Listen to me, that is not always true. Do you do it sometimes? Yes. Can you improve? Yes, but you're not always like that. And then I believe there's the spiritual side. For me, it's scripture and prayer, meditation, being silent and quiet and calming your own person has great value in it. And so valuable to do it. So there are 6 responses to your negative self-talk that we need to be aware of. I just want to check here. It's a lot of writing, that little exercise, but with time and you'll develop the skill and be able to do it in your head. So there's a good exercise to use. By practicing this, we can change our negative situations, our negative self-talk, and move towards positive action. You know, sometimes we self-talk ourselves into not doing something because it looks so large. I don't know where to begin to get it done. Let me give you a piece of advice. Start. There are times when I've sat there in a course and I've got 25 speech evaluations that I have to do, and right now I have to do it on Zoom. And I was going through, I think it was about 24, 25 speeches, started yesterday, finished them today. Oh, that's a lot. That's a lot. But wait a minute. I love doing this. So start. So I started with the one, finished up the evaluation, went through. I got all but about 5 or 6 done, and then I finished those up today. And then I sent the students my evaluation form with the grade in it. It feels so good right now because that one class, that first speech completely done. I've got 3 of my 4 courses. All the speeches are done, and they've gotten my feedback in regard to the speech. That's a lot of work, but oh, you know what I'm saying? When you have a negative self-talk, start somewhere. Don't sit back and just allow it to happen because it'll be destructive to you, and it's not helpful when you allow that to happen. So the fact is that all of us deal with self-talk stuff. Now, we're not going to answer these questions here, but these are questions that are valuable for you to think about. Have you noticed that you self-talk? Just sit back and say, you do or you don't. If you don't self-talk, I'd be surprised. But think about your moments of self-talk. Enter into it with your mind saying, wait a minute, I'm talking to myself here. Number 2, how would you describe the nature of your self-talk? Is it negative? Sometimes negative? Is it positive or sometimes positive? We all have moments that are positive or negative. Question number 3, what is one thought that you gained or had re-emphasized that is important and helpful to you right now? I'm not asking you to answer it out loud, but stop and think about that. What is one thought about self-talk that is really, really helpful for you and you realize is significant and important? And focus on that. It'll be beneficial to you. I'm going to stop. I've got to, in about 2 minutes, I got to start recording. I mean, not recording, but downloading. So I get it done before my next class starts. And I want to just wish you a good Thanksgiving. Enjoy this coming weekend. And we're not meeting Monday, as you know. So we will see you 1 week today. So I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.